If you can't get stuff done, you haven't got time to innovate. You're more frustrated. It's always about behaviours and people and how people use technologies. When organisations invest in technology, they don't invest enough in training on that technology so people can actually use it to deliver value.
Technology is easy, people are hard, says Sharon O'Dea. She's here on the Culturedge Podcast to share what it takes to inspire teams in the digital workplaces of tomorrow. Hi there, Sharon. Welcome to the Culturedge Podcast. Great to have you here today.
Thanks. Thanks for inviting me on.
And we're joined by David as well.
Great to see you, Steve. Great to see you, Sharon.
Super. Well, maybe you could kick off, Sharon. Tell us a bit about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, thank you. So hello, I'm Sharon O'Dea and I'm one of the co-founders of Lithos Partners. We're a little boutique agency that specialises in digital comms, digital transformation and digital workplace. So all the collaboration and communication tools that you use inside organisations to work together effectively and get the best out of your people.
And who are your main clients then today?
So we work with mostly large and complex organisations. So we particularly seem to have found a niche in working with anywhere that's difficult because of scale or regulation. So we work with quite a few banks, working with some world-class universities at the moment, corporates of various shapes and sizes in energy, pharma, that kind of thing. So it tends to be organisations that have got gnarly problems in this sort of space.
Yeah. Does that correlate with international businesses especially, or not necessarily?
Almost always, yeah. So generally speaking, it's when organisations have got some kind of scale, so they're multinational, multilingual, across multiple jurisdictions legally, or because of the governance set up or that they're regulated. And often it's all of those things at the same time.
Sure. And so how did you get into this? What prompted you to set up this line of work?
I think I began working comms. Like everyone, no one really plans when they leave university to go and work in communications. They always do it by mistake and end up there. But I'm a communicator by trade. Actually, I started life as a journalist, but many years ago. It wasn't a very good one. But moved into communications, and then I've always been a massive nerd. So I always found myself at the geekier end of communication, so the digital end of that, the scale. And it happened to be just at the time when these things were really starting to take hold inside organisations. So social media was starting to become a thing, and I was always sort of the forefront of that change, which I really like. So as I said, I'm a bit of a geek. So I ended up working in government and then in banking, helping organisations to make sense of these things, to communicate with their people, particularly internally. And when I left there, so I worked at Standard Chartered for a good few years, and when I left there, I actually had this vague idea to sort of get into the broader product and innovation space, but actually I strangely ended up almost back where I started. So in intranets, digital workplaces, internal comms and digital transformation. I think it's because I increasingly realised how central all of that was to helping organisations to function and maybe more than that, to thrive, I guess. People need to connect and collaborate to make change happen. And actually the tools and processes and capabilities they have to do that is really important. And I ended up joining forces with my now business partner, Jonathan. So I was head of digital comms at Standard Chartered, and he was head of digital comms at Coca-Cola. So it's quite a natural fit working together to have, working in that kind of corporate space. We both know how this stuff works in large and complex organisations. And I guess the rest is history. Been doing this for 8 years now, 8.5. Wow. Yeah.
And I hear a lot of pivots in there by the sound of things, and almost no entrepreneur I speak to ends up succeeding exactly where they expected to succeed. There's always some element of changing along the way as to what they do. And you must have come across your fair share of surprises and things that didn't pan out at all as you expected. Do you have maybe a couple of examples of what might be more surprising in your journey?
In my journey, let me have a think. I mean, what I find working with organisations is how different this is in every organisation. So for a while, I got a little bit jaded with the intranet digital workplace space, because you're like, oh, same tool, different company. Actually, trying to make these things work inside even organisations that on the face of it are quite similar is interesting every time. And that's what keeps it interesting. They have completely different challenges, you'd think it would be more uniform than it is, which is what I think means I'm still doing it after all these, whatever it is, 20 years, I guess, in this broader space. So finding that nice mix of platforms and tools, I'm always surprised by how every organization has completely different challenges, even or different ways of approaching the same problems.
Yeah, without naming and shaming, unless you're able to, could you share a couple of examples of what you mean there?
So as an example, at the moment, I'm working with two different very well-known universities. They're both very, even on the face of it, they're structured in the same kind of way, but actually they're at very different maturity in terms of their digital maturity and the way that they're approaching kind of product thinking. And that in turn impacts the degree to which they're able to go on that kind of digital transformation journey. So it's been kind of fascinating to compare and contrast organizations that from the outside might look close to identical.
Yeah, so some you find you're probably having to teach them a lot of core principles, definitions, terminology, real basic building blocks of.
Well, yeah, and I think one of the things that we end up doing quite a lot is almost kind of being a little kind of like parrot on the client's shoulder, where they're trying to navigate their way through an organization, and actually they just need a little bit of a sounding board, some support, because I certainly know from my time in-house at various corporates, actually so much of it is just about building stakeholder support internally for change, because there's so many pockets of resistance everywhere. And actually a lot of it is helping people understand the possibilities, but also to share that enthusiasm with others. So actually what's fascinating is to help people inside organizations to navigate the internal politics, and to build a case for change, which is actually about building alliances across organizations, right?
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
So the three of us have got experiences in banking. You talk about the external and internal politics. What do you think are some of the biggest challenges? And again, not necessarily naming names, I know you work with some of them, for the established banks today, and maybe particularly in terms of innovation, digitization, especially when you look at them against sort of the neo or challenger banks.
So, I mean, we hear about this a lot, that they're dealing with all their legacy tech and culture. Actually, maybe if you forgive me just a moment with this torturous analogy, but I'll roll with it. So our company name, Lithos Partners, comes from the word lithification. So my co-founder is a geologist by trade. And lithification is the process by which sediment becomes rock. So you get layers of basically dirt that build up over time, and then over geological time it compacts to become solid rock. And we end up coming up with this because we realize that actually the same is absolutely true in organizations. They're built up of layers of basically organizational sediment, of technology, culture, takeovers, mergers, histories, disasters, and they're over time kind of compacts to become who you are. And that some of that is cultural and some of that is structural. But if you want to work with organizations, you have to understand the formation of that rock and work with it, because it's going nowhere. And actually, so what we kind of find with banks is a really good example of that, because they're often, come together through centuries of mergers and history and layers of terrible technology. But the fact is they exist, and that's how they are. So actually, where they are being challenged from all sides by neo banks of all shapes and sizes and other fintech startups, actually they're coming in fresh, but they're not dealing with the same kind of historical issues and the scale that they're dealing with. So we have to understand why they are the way they are, rather than just coming in and saying you're just doing everything wrong, which is what a lot of consultancies tend to do, I find. And then thinking about our area of work in particular, what I found is, again, due to the challenge from some of the newer players, they've really upped their game on user experience. You think about if any of us are still using our legacy banking apps, but anything customer facing always takes priority over any internal facing systems and tools. So what we find is that internal digital experience is still terrible. And that has huge impacts on both engagement, but actually particularly productivity, and that into innovation as well. That if you can't get stuff done, you haven't got time to innovate. You're more frustrated. So actually what we're finding is, I don't. Do you remember from banking? We work with some brilliant people. They hire some fantastic minds and really talented and tenacious people, and then just make it really hard to get stuff done. So I think talented people really want to make an impact, but all too often all they're making is PowerPoint. So yes, there is this. How do we? I think one of the challenges of banks is, how do you unlock that potential rather than lock it down. And there's a risk management thing that means that they don't.
It's definitely a pattern that I recognise from from banks, other big companies as well, but
Yeah.
banks focusing so much on their internal processes and spending so much time and energy on things that should be quite straightforward and simple. But I'd imagine every bank is a bit different. But
Yeah.
what do you think are some common root causes, from your perspective, having worked with a few of these big banks? What do you think are some of the common root causes for why do they spend so much time and energy on the internal politics and the stakeholder management and getting internal pitches just right at the cost of, like you said, the internal digital experience and productivity?
Is it an abundance of caution, I suppose, that everyone wants to be sure that there is by definition or by necessity, I suppose, there is a need to ensure you've got the right air cover, but also that, you're covered from a risk management perspective. But it does mean that there is always a preference to say no rather than yes to any kind of any change. What I also find is actually just dealing with the problems of scale. When you are really large, actually, when you have so many other people who are either competing for budget, for time, for attention, or simply there are concerns about how you might run something or what the impacts might be. So again, there's this tendency to try and push problems down or to push change down the road rather than attempt to tackle it now or to make any kind of innovative changes. So there is that. I think part of it is, in order to make anything happen, you do have to build that coalition of support, and that means you're throwing all your energy into internal stakeholder engagement rather than actually making the change, and that's a huge opportunity cost, right?
For sure, yeah. How do you see it, David? What would you identify as the root causes?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's in a way, if you put your neck on the line, you have to be pretty sure that the guillotine's not going to drop, and you have to be very confident, whereas actually just saying nothing and holding back or going along with whoever is above you, and if it's not broken, you essentially don't fix it. Whereas actually, if you're starting from scratch and you don't have those legacy issues and you put something in place, it's obviously tends to be a lot easier to pull them out. Whereas I remember working with systems that were no longer supported by Microsoft and Lotus, for instance. So I was using Lotus Notes, and there was a problem with it, and was told, well, there isn't actually any support for it because the manufacturer has discontinued it. And this is when Google wasn't quite as good as it was. So tried to Google it, and there was just nothing there. And so what do we do?
All the experts had retired by that point.
Well, this was it. And they said, you say, well, what do we do? And it's, well, we can't move the system. It would be too painful. And it's like, well, you're working with a system that's no longer supported. We surely should fix this.
Yeah, and the other thing that, and this is not just true of banks, I think it's lots of large organizations, suddenly then get an over focus on the technology, that the technology will solve the problem. And actually one of my most overused phrases, people get tired of me saying it, is that technology is easy, people are hard. And actually, I'm sure we'll end up talking about AI at some point, but there's always the latest wave of technology, and it's not, if you install it, it will immediately change the way that we get things done. Actually, it's always about behaviors and people and how people use technology. So like the OBR in one of their budget reports actually refer repeatedly to one of the root causes of the low productivity in the UK is underinvestment in technology, but also when organizations invest in technology, they don't invest enough in training on that technology so people can actually use it to deliver value.
Totally.
And the poor quality of management in the UK. And both of those things are needed to unlock the value from investment in other tools. So I'm working with Oxford University at the moment. So actually, even 1,000-year-old organization needs to innovate and to digitize, but that means not just bringing in a new tool, but actually looking at all of the things around that. So your systems of decision making, your governance, but actually some of the capabilities as well. You can bring in new tools, but there's no point if they're not aligned with your ways of working, with your objectives, and that people have the capability and understanding and confidence to actually use them.
Yeah, I've got a theory, Sharon. Curious to get your thoughts on this. My theory, you mentioned an overabundance of caution, which I've witnessed as well. My theory is that following the whole global financial crisis, there was obviously a lot more regulation put on banks and financial institutions. The opportunity for bonuses has been capped across most jurisdictions. So the upside is far more limited than it was, let's say, 15, 20 years ago. And so I wonder, has that been also a factor that's led to the fact that you think, well, my upside of taking this risk is negligible. Maybe I get promoted after 3 years and a slight salary increase, which is going to get taxed at 50%. And I have a long, stable career at this bank, so long as I don't upset anyone. Or I take this risk and, well, there's only really downside to it. So there's an asymmetry involved in taking any risk, whether it be innovation or any kind of new financial product. So that biases pretty much everyone towards saying, I'd rather say no. So no becomes the default answer.
And then the flip side of that is, if you are prepared to take a risk, you can only really do that elsewhere, which is why you see people going to startups or creating their own startup, because then you do have that risk reward. But also the ability to move at pace as well. So it does mean that we actually, it's creating those disincentives to innovate inside organizations.
And even when
like
people
you said, David, it's your neck on the line then, isn't it?
Yeah. And even when people are in favor of a change, they'll tend to be lukewarm, so they can say, well, if it's a success, I liked that change and I was for it. And if it doesn't work out, they can say, well, I was only lukewarm on that success, so I wasn't fully behind it.
Yeah.
And I think that's the problem, because you say it's that asymmetry of where the payoff is going to be.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're in a startup and you do something and you can capture a lot more of that value, it becomes a lot more interesting as well. And again, there's going to be the downside there, but the upside will be much more interesting, hopefully.
Yeah, well, it reminds me exactly on that topic, David. I used to coach innovation teams at a big bank, and I used to warn them often of what I called stake-free stakeholders. So these were people, managers, who insisted on showing up at meetings, and they were very directive and said, you should do that, you should not do that. But when it came to, oh, great, so can we have a member of your team to act as an expert on this, come join us 2 days a week, suddenly the stake would evaporate. And like you say, David, if ever things didn't work out, then surprise, surprise, the post-mortem meeting wouldn't involve these same stakeholders. So it's a very, again, asymmetrical way of covering themselves and not taking too much risk. Okay, well, I think we've agreed on quite a few of these different root causes. Let's flip it around and make it a bit more positive now. So, well, imagine, Shara, that we're a potential client, a big bank coming to you and saying, all the things we just mentioned, we've got these problems inside our bank. How can you help us? What would you propose to do to come in and start fixing some of these root cause issues?
So every project that we do is different, and actually it breaks down to 3 areas of work, which is what I would call kind of discovery, development, delivery. But discovery, I think, is the most important one. That most of our projects come about because maybe a head of communications or innovation has come in and said, we know we have an issue, but we don't really know what it is or what the causes are or what we can do about it. So generally speaking, most of our projects will start with what we call discovery, which is where we can use a range of different methods, but they'll usually involve interviews with stakeholders, some user research, actually going in and looking at how people get stuff done, or how they find information. Really enlightening. I love doing things like if you go into an organization and see what things they've got on post-it notes around their desk, or all the things that they printed off because they don't believe they'll ever find again, or and actually you talk to people about about the context in which they work and where they experience problems. And that often there's a huge disconnect between how systems and tools are designed and the real ways that people work that just mean that you're left somewhat stymied. So the real focus I work then is to really understand how things are working now, how they should be working, and the context in which people are working and what they're trying to get done, and also what the future looks like, because remember, this landscape is changing all the time. And from that, we can then start to make some suggestions around what you might need. And sometimes that's a new platform. for communication, for collaboration. But actually these days, generally speaking, organizations probably have the right tools. They're just not necessarily using them correctly. So it can often be a combination of, improvements to governance, having a proper strategy, and then building teams around around that. So then we can move on to the development phase, which is really putting some shape around that. So we can help organizations to choose a new tool, or to spin up teams, or to create a strategy for how they will be communicating, collaborating in the future. And then less often we get involved in more of the delivery end, which is the end-to-end delivery of new platforms and channels for collaboration and communication. But what we find with all of this is, for it to be a success, one, it has to be designed around the way that you work. So it's really good to get that kind of detailed understanding of what's working and what some of the barriers are currently. And then also any investment in tools and capabilities are only useful if those things are used by people. So actually, what can we do to drive adoption? And again, that all comes down to making it work for the way people work and the realities of your organization. Going back to my rock analogy at the beginning.
Yeah. And how long does it take typically? So if just to manage our expectations as clients, how long should we forecast?
A classic consultant answer, it depends. But typically a discovery will probably be about sort of 2.5 to 3.5 months. Mm-hmm. Depending on the size of your organization and the depth of research that you want to do. But yeah, generally speaking, we can get through it in just like a couple of months, 3 months.
Yeah. And who do you need access to carry out that discovery?
So it will depend again, but normally it will be to have a look at your existing systems. How are things working now? So that could be your existing intranet digital workplace, but your other channels that you have as well, but also a nice cross-section of stakeholders. So we tend to break it down into 2 parts. One will be your kind of more senior stakeholders. That would be comms would be one, IT, operations, normally whatever your business actually does. Then talk to some of the senior folk there, but also then just a really good cross-section of people working in different roles. What we find is that can be really enlightening, the disconnect between those two. So we might break that down into, actually, this research doesn't have to be that in-depth, and that after about the first 15 people, you hear the same things over and over, unless they have radically different experiences and contexts. But actually, what we find is you'll see big disconnects between people in HQ and people who are out on the road, metaphorically or physically. But also potentially across different geographies. So we'll try and speak to a good cross-section of real employees as well about their experiences, and get a sense of how things are used in practice and what people's real needs are as well.
And how are you seeing the cultural differences? Because obviously we work together in London, you're both in Amsterdam. Do you see much of the difference in adoption and willingness to work with you, or what sort of things that sort of really stand out? Because obviously you've got that international experience, which is kind of the other end of the spectrum from the banks.
There are definite cultural differences in people's propensity to engage with this kind of thing. What I found really interesting, actually, I've had 2 client organizations in the last year in the US, and that is oddly more different than Europe and Asia, and I think some of that might be because, under European law, and I think also just culturally, there is an obligation to consult. We expect to hear things from our employees. So we have channels and processes for that kind of thing, and we expect there to be, and people do engage with them. The US has much more of a hire and fire kind of culture, and there is actually no expectation that your organization will really communicate with you in any useful way at all. So employees don't really want to do it in the same kind of way, and employees don't expect to engage with it. So it's really interesting seeing that contrast. And I find, and then other parts of the world have much more of a joining in kind of culture, the more communitarian, I suppose. So it's really interesting to see the levels. All that said, in multinational organizations, it's often led from wherever the lead organization is. You won't see such differences in footprint because they tend to communicate across the network. But where things are geographically in one place, US-led organizations tend to be very, very different from those which have European and Asian operations, just in terms of their collaboration readiness, I suppose. Mm-hmm.
And do you find that people take on your suggestions more willingly, again, different in cultures? I think sometimes there's that famous sort of meme of when the British person says, "Oh, that's a good idea," and what various people hear when they hear that.
I never do a kind of dump a report and walk out, because you know it ends up in a drawer. So what we tend to do is come up with more of like a roadmap approach of kind of a bunch of quick wins that are cheap and you could do without, whereas some longer term objectives, and then spend time with whatever team commissioned us on kind of a road mapping exercise. So it's not just here's what we recommend, but here's some things we recommend. This is how much they will cost you. Here's where these are tools that you might want to buy. These are the approaches you might want to take. And actually what we tend to find is if you make the small cheap changes, then you build support to do the bigger ones. But we kind of work with those teams on how you can sequence that, and actually, what budget you might need and when to do that. So actually what you might find is, to oversimplify it, here's some things you can do to improve your existing channel mix now that will possibly cost you very little or nothing at all. These are some changes to process that you can make as a team, and then actually you might want to build a business case over the next year to invest in a new platform. But what I don't find, so actually what we find is people do take on our suggestions. They may get blocked down the road if budget isn't available, but what we find is we need to co-create not just a single solution, but a roadmap of improvements that they can deliver. And then we also have to recognize that we might make some suggestions and recommendations for today, but the world of work is changing around us. So this is what we need to do, is build in flexibility as well for a world of work that's changing really, really quickly for a lot of people.
Yeah, so as I say, talking about flexibility, obviously you were doing this before COVID and after. I know COVID isn't necessarily the story it was, but I still feel like working from home has become even more of a battleground. I've got friends who originally were on sort of 2 days a week from home, and now they're getting nudged into sort of 4 or 5. Are you seeing much difference with that? And is that ever a recommendation that you could actually your firms could provide more flexibility to their teams?
I think it's being driven the other way. Interestingly, I find this much less with global organizations, because they were already working this way. When you're working in a multinational organization, it kind of doesn't matter so much if you're in the office, if all the people you're speaking to are in Singapore. I used to drag myself into the city for 7 o'clock in the morning to get on calls to speak to people who were in Chennai. It was madness. I could have done it from my spare room in a nice quiet environment. And actually, so banks and other multinationals were already doing this. It was actually much less pronounced shift for them. What we found is often they just didn't have they've never done it in an intentional sort of way. So actually there's much more around how do we create those moments of serendipity so that we can make the most of our co-located time. But what it's the mid-sized organizations that it's become more of a battleground, where they were much more presence-based. What I have found is this definitely went through a phase. The early days of COVID, it's like, oh Christ, we've got Teams, but what are we supposed to do with it? So there was a lot more on like, how can we ensure that we built in the right kind of processes to make up and enable our people to feel more connected to one another. And actually then there was a bit of a recovery mode, which was, oh well, everyone started using all of these tools. They had them before, they started using during COVID, and actually they've got some really terrible habits in terms of how these things have been used. So we need to unlearn and relearn in more useful ways. And actually now there is this sort of, the last maybe year and a half, there is a recognition that this is here to stay, and that actually we need to take a more of a strategic approach to what is our model of working together and communicating in a world where this is only going one way. And that so what we're finding there is actually we've got organizations who are looking at their kind of overall infrastructure for communication and collaboration, and actually thinking, right, what do we do to build in a more flexible way of working?
And are you prescriptive in your services to clients in that way? Do you recommend that they take such and such an approach to flexible working or hybrid working?
No, every organization is different. And the reality is, most organizations are frontline organizations anyway. So, 70% of workers worldwide are in frontline roles. They also need to be communicated with and to be able to. So actually, this isn't just about HQ organizations. It's about, people who work in branches or in hospitals or out on an oil rig, or, actually that kind of the need to connect people across networks is pretty universal. And it isn't just a battle about who's in and out of the office. And what we need to do is ensure that everyone inside organizations is able to connect with the center and to connect with one another.
And in terms of the new clients that you onboard, do they tend to find you? Is it through recommendations, referrals? Yep.
Yeah, it's a tricky one because when we first started doing this, if you go out and say, oh, we do digital transformation, so does everyone else. You're really indistinguishable from all the other kind of hand-waving digital consultant types. But then if we go super specific, we do intranets and digital workplaces, actually you almost become a little bit too niche. What we found is actually it's ended up in this weird sweet spot in between where almost all of our clients come through referral. So it's either people we've worked with before who've moved and gone to another organization and got a similar problem, or they've been recommended by someone, and that they don't really know what they need necessarily. They just know that they have an engagement problem or their collaboration isn't working as effectively as they would like, and they want to explore what's wrong and what they might be able to do in the future. So generally speaking, we don't, I speak at conferences and stuff like that, but apart from that, we don't really do any kind of marketing. I think it's just, we do work with a lot of large and complex organizations. And I think it's because we understand the challenges that come with making this sort of thing happen in organizations that, as we already talked about, are quite resistant to change a lot of the time. So yeah, we do see similar challenges, but very different approaches. And I guess we do decent quality work, so people are happy and recommend us to people.
Yeah, I'm going to make a wild guess and assume that pretty much every client asks you something about AI relative to what they're doing today, or maybe how you might be able to help them. What sort of problems do they have? What do they want help with specifically when they talk about AI with you?
The interesting thing is they don't even know what their problem is they're trying to solve a lot of the time. They know they have a solution and they're trying, and they're almost trying to work out, should we be using this? I've heard everyone else is using this. The big one at the moment in the enterprise space is Microsoft Copilot.
Yeah.
And should we be using this? They read all the vendor claims about this will, give us 30% productivity savings. And I'm quite cynical. I'm actually a big AI enthusiast. I think it's got huge potential. But Microsoft have been promising to transform our productivity for 20 years. And I don't know about you, but my diary is not getting any emptier. So I'm somewhat cynical about it. I think there's an overfocus on the technology, but I have to be really honest with organizations and say, you're not going to get results from it unless you invest in the really unsexy work of governance and capability.
Process.
And I know it's boring, but it's really important. Like in the world of internal comms in particular, there is we can just create personalized content for everyone, or basically in effect just reinventing search, that you'll be able to create content, say how much time off have I got. The reality is we're really bad at file management and always have been. No one throws anything away ever. So what you're doing is just taking old, incorrect and inaccurate information and just regenerating it into new misleading information. And actually there's huge risks associated with that. So until we get better at tidying up and managing the content we have, it's a real problem. And the other thing I find is AI, it's a bit like all the other technologies we've had. You don't just switch it on and it solves your problems. This is about having people working effectively with technology. There's definitely things we do at work that's beneath us. The amount of time I certainly spend on admin, and I know I did when I was in-house, on tasks that you'd really rather not be doing and not very good at. But it's identifying, things like accountability and the ethics associated with that. People need the understanding of the tools and their shortcomings, as well as understanding where accountability, some of those issues around decision making. It's not about outsourcing your work to a tool. It's using those tools effectively to help you work more productively. And again, that's the boring work of training and capability that we need to invest in.
Well, it's that joke that I forget who said it. It was a lady on LinkedIn whose name will obviously come to me when we've finished with the episode, but it was about, I want AI to do my dishes and laundry so I can focus on doing art and writing. But at the moment, it's preoccupied with doing the things I want to do.
Yeah. Oh, exactly. So I was on the one of the founders of the panel. I'm a member of the Chartered Institute of Public Relations, it's the professional body for communicators. And a few years back, 7 years ago now, feels like forever, we founded the AI and PR panel, and that was to explore the role of artificial intelligence in the communications industry. And actually, one of the things we did as one of the earliest pieces of work was to break down the communicator's role into its kind of constituent areas of work, and then explore to what extent could you automate this, and to what extent is it currently being automated? And there's a whole bunch of stuff that actually communicators are largely word people, really bad at things like performance tracking and like looking at data more generally. Planning, they're really bad at. Evaluation, actually, this and that's the kind of boring work that actually AI could be loads better at than us. But if you do that, then you free up time to do the things that we're much better at, because communication is ultimately about empathy. And that's so the potential is there, but it is about exploring it in a really thoughtful way. And then I guess another thing that is really interesting is going back a little bit to the conversation we had, several steps ago about the tendency to say no to things and that kind of abundance of caution. Because people don't understand AI, there is a tendency to go, well, I'm not sure about that. And actually, a very important part of the appropriation process for any new technology is first you understand it, then you understand broadly what it does, and then you apply it to your own context and you find your own affordances for it. And we're not there with AI yet because people aren't kind of willing to just play around with it. You can just be sort of slightly silly with it in a safe sort of space. But also then once you do that, you can then explore, it could be useful for this, it could be useful for that. And I heard someone speak at an event recently from a pharmaceutical company, but I cannot remember which one. And they have a bi-weekly AI newsletter of just how other people are using it, which I just really liked. Because instead of saying, when anything gets rolled out of work, it's like, these are all the things you shouldn't do. And what people take away from that is, I probably shouldn't use it at all.
Yeah, dangerous.
Well, actually, what this does is these are all the things that people are doing in our secure enterprise version of this tool. And have you thought, and it just sparks those ideas on how you might be able to use it in the flow of your own work, which I just really liked as an approach, and maybe we should do more of that, kind of giving people space to experiment.
It's also more useful than speculation, because a lot of the content, like you say, is these are all the things you're not allowed to do because of the rules. But also, wouldn't it be wonderful if we did this and that, and lots of dreamy possibilities? Whereas, hey, this is what people in the market are already experimenting with. It's very concrete and tangible for people.
Exactly. And then you could go, okay, I'm doing something that is different to that, but maybe has some similar characteristics. I'll give it a crack, which I think is a really really nice way of approaching that. It's kind of from the other side of exploring possibilities rather than problems.
That's right, yeah. Well, we're going to wrap up in a minute, Sharon. Before doing so, if someone would like to reach out to you, whether it's a client or someone who's interested in discussing these topics with you more, what are the best ways to contact you?
Okay, so our website, which isn't very good actually, cobbler's shoes and all that, is Lithos.Partners, or I'm just Sharon O'Dea all over the internet, so you can find me on LinkedIn or the site formerly known as Twitter, or anywhere else for that matter.
We'll add those links in the comments of this video so everyone can find those. So I want to say great big thanks to you, Sharon.
And thank you so much for having me on. I really enjoyed talking.
Thanks, Sharon. Good to see you.
And you.